The air at the Miller Farm auction hung thick and heavy, a mix of diesel exhaust, stale coffee, and the sweet, dusty smell of turned-over soil from the fields beyond. It was the spring of 1972, and the feeling in the crowd was electric. Grain prices were climbing higher than anyone had ever seen, and the banks were practically giving money away. It was a time for expansion, a time for new iron. I stood near the back, my hands tucked into the pockets of my worn denim jacket, watching the spectacle. My name is Jedediah Stone, and the farm I worked was the same one my grandfather broke with a team of mules. It was a modest 320 acres of the best black dirt in Cedar County, and it was mine, free and clear. My father had seen to that before the cancer took him. His final words to me weren't about love or the afterlife. They were about the farm. "Don't you ever let a banker get his hooks in this place, boy," he'd rasped, his hand gripping mine with a strength that defied his withered frame. "Debt is a yoke, and this land is meant to be free." I'd taken his words to heart. My machinery wasn't new, but it was mine. The heart of my operation was a 1968 John Deere 4020, a side console synchro range that I knew better than I knew myself. Every hiss of its hydraulics, every puff of black smoke from the stack when it bit into a tough patch of ground was a language I understood. Alongside it was my father's old Farmall M, still earning its keep on the auger and the hay rake. They were paid for, they were honest. The auctioneer's chant rose to a fever pitch. And now, folks, the crown jewel of the sale, a brand new, barely used International Harvester 1066. This beauty's got the cab, the air, the radio, less than 200 hours on the clock. Who'll start the bidding at $20,000? A murmur went through the crowd. $20,000. That was more than my father had paid for our first 80 acres. Earl Thompson's hand shot up. Of course it did. Earl was my neighbor to the west. He'd inherited his place around the same time I'd inherited mine, but our philosophies were as different as night and day. Earl saw the soaring prices and the easy credit as a ladder to the sky. He'd already bought the quarter section north of him and was farming it on shares. He saw my cautious approach, my adherence to my father's old ways, as a weakness. "I've got 20,000 from Mr. Thompson. Who'll give me 21? The auctioneer cried. No one else dared. Earl stood there, arms crossed, a smug grin on his face. He caught my eye and gave me a little nod, as if to say, "This is how it's done, Stone. Get big or get out." The hammer fell. The shiny red tractor was his. As the crowd started to disperse, I made my way over to the rows of miscellaneous parts and old tools. That was where the real treasures were. I was looking for a specific hydraulic cylinder for my old John Deere disc. I found a likely candidate, covered in grease and rust, but solid underneath. While I was haggling with the auctioneer's runner, Earl swaggered over, the keys to his new 1066 dangling from his finger. "Buying more junk for your museum, Jed?" he said, his voice loud enough for the men nearby to hear. A few of them chuckled. "It'll do the job, Earl," I said, not looking up from the cylinder. "The job?" "Jed, the world is passing you by. That 4020 of yours is a relic. While you're out there eating dust and sweating in the sun, I'll be in my air-conditioned cab, listening to the ball game, farming twice the ground in half the time. My 4020 doesn't have a payment book that comes with it," I said quietly. Earl laughed, a short, sharp bark. "You gotta spend money to make money. It's called leverage. The bank is begging to loan me money at 5%. It's practically free. You're sitting on a paid-for farm, scared to use it. Your old man was a good farmer, Jed, but his time has passed. This is a new age." He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to seem friendly but felt like a shove. "You ought to think about it. You could be somebody. Instead, you're rooting around in the scrap pile." He walked away, joining a group of other farmers who were slapping him on the back, congratulating him on his purchase. They looked over at me, shaking their heads with a mixture of pity and contempt. I was the fool, the dinosaur who didn't know he was already extinct. I paid $10 for the hydraulic cylinder, loaded it into the back of my Ford pickup, and drove home. The whole way, Earl's words echoed in my head. Was he right? Was I being foolish? The temptation was there, a constant whisper in the back of my mind. The bank manager, Mr. Henderson, had called me just last week. He'd talked about expansion, about my farm's equity, about low-interest loans that could put me in a brand new 4430 and a six-bottom plough to go with it. I could trade in the 4020, get a bigger planter, maybe even pick up the 80 acres for sale down by the river. It was the American dream, or so they said. But all I could see was my father's face, the deep lines of worry etched around his eyes from the lean years of the 50s. All I could hear was his voice. Debt is a yoke. Before we go any further into the grease and the grit of the next few years, I have to ask you something. Put yourself in my boots back there in 72. You've got a farm, paid in full. You've got a neighbor who's borrowing big and looking like a genius. The whole world is telling you to take the easy money and expand. What would you have done? Would you have listened to the ghost of your father, or would you have signed on the dotted line with the banker? Let me know down in the comments what path you would have chosen. I'm curious to know. The spring of 73 was wet, the kind of relentless, soul-soaking wet that turns black dirt into a bottomless mire. Every morning I'd wake up to the sound of rain drumming on the tin roof of the farmhouse, and my heart would sink a little deeper. The calendar pages were turning, and my corn wasn't in the ground. Across the fence line I could hear the distant rumble of Earl Thompson's new 1060X. He'd bought a bigger, heavier disc and was managing to mud his crop in, leaving deep, compacted ruts that would haunt his yields later. But he was getting it done. The lights on his tractor cab glowed late into the night, a constant mocking reminder of my own idleness. Finally, a break. 3 days of wind and sun, just enough to dry the topsoil. It was now or never. I filled the 40i20 with diesel, checked the oil and greased every fitting until the old grease pushed out, clean and new. The tractor fired up with its familiar comforting roar, a plume of black smoke clearing to a steady rhythmic puff. I hitched up the 6-row planter, the seed boxes filled to the brim, and headed for the field. The first 2 passes went like a dream. The soil was working up perfectly, crumbling just right. The smell of the earth, rich and alive, was better than any perfume. This was what I lived for. This was the rhythm of my life. On the 3rd pass, as I was lifting the planter on the headland, it happened. A sharp whine from under the seat, a shudder that ran through the whole machine, and then the hydraulics went dead. The planter slammed back down to the ground. I tried the lever again. Nothing. Just the sickening whine of a pump starving for oil or a relief valve screaming in protest. A cold dread washed over me. The window for planting was closing fast. A breakdown like this wasn't a matter of inconvenience. It was a threat to my entire year, my entire livelihood. I unhitched the planter in the field and limped the 4020 back to the machine shed. For the rest of the afternoon, I consulted the big, greasy John Deere service manual, its pages soft as cloth from years of use. The symptoms pointed to one thing: the main hydraulic pump, buried deep in the tractor's transmission case. It wasn't a simple fix. It was major surgery. The next morning, I started tearing it down. The machine shed was my sanctuary, filled with the smells of oil, steel, and hard work. I drained the hydraulic fluid, a torrent of amber oil that seemed to take an eternity to empty. Then came the real work. The rockshaft housing, a piece of cast iron weighing hundreds of pounds, had to come off. I hooked up the chain hoist, carefully wrapping straps around the heavy casting. Bolt by stubborn bolt, fighting with breaker bars and extensions, I worked it loose. The air turned blue with my curses as a rusted nut refused to budge. I heated it with the torch until it glowed cherry red, then hit it with the impact wrench. It finally gave with a screech of tortured metal. By noon, I had the housing off, revealing the guts of the tractor. There it was, the hydraulic pump, a complex assembly of pistons and valves that was the heart of the machine. I could see the problem immediately. A key on the main drive shaft had sheared, letting the drive gear spin freely. The pump wasn't turning. I spent the afternoon on the phone. The local John Deere dealer didn't have the parts. "That's an old tractor, Jed," the parts man said, not unkindly. "We might be able to order them, but it could take a week, maybe more." A week. In my mind, I could see the weeds starting to poke through the soil, the rain clouds gathering on the horizon. A week was a lifetime I didn't have. I called a salvage yard 2 counties over. "Yeah, I think we got a 4020 we tore down last year. the owner grunted. "Come on down and see what you can find." My wife, Sarah, packed me a sandwich and a thermos of coffee. Her face was tight with worry, but she didn't say a word against my plan. She knew this was how it had to be. We didn't have the money to just call out a dealer mechanic and pay him a fortune for a job I could do myself. The salvage yard was a graveyard of green and red iron. Rusting hulks of tractors and combines sat in silent rows, picked clean like skeletons. After an hour of searching, I found it. The transmission case of a wrecked 4020, half buried in the mud. I spent the next 3 hours lying in the dirt, wrestling the pump out of the dead tractor. It was greasy, back-breaking work. By the time I had it free, I was covered in a thick layer of grime and hydraulic oil from head to toe. That night, I didn't stop for supper. Working under the bare bulb of the machine shed light, I meticulously cleaned and inspected the salvaged pump. Its internals looked good. I replaced the seals and gaskets, using the kit I'd had the foresight to buy from the dealer, and began the painstaking process of reassembly. Every bolt had to be torqued just right, every connection sealed perfectly. Around 10 o'clock, a pair of headlights swept across the open shed door. It was Earl Thompson in his new pickup. He killed the engine and walked over, a thermos in his hand. "Saw your light on," he said, his tone dripping with false concern. "Heard you had some trouble." News traveled fast in a small community. "Just a little hydraulic problem," I said, not looking up from my work. "Little problem? Jed, your planter's been sitting in the field for 2 days. I finished my corn this afternoon." He took a sip from his thermos. "Look, I feel for you, I really do. Tell you what, I'll come over in the morning with my 1066 and my planter and finish up for you. For $100 an hour, I'll have you done by noon. It's the neighborly thing to do." I finally stopped and looked at him, my hands black with grease, my body aching with fatigue. $100 an hour. He wasn't being neighborly, he was kicking me when I was down. He was trying to prove his point, that his way was better, that my way was destined for failure. "Thanks for the offer, Earl," I said, my voice tight, "but I'll handle it myself." He shrugged, a smirk playing on his lips. "Suit yourself, but don't come crying to me when you're trying to plant in June. Some people just have to learn the hard way." He turned and left, the crunch of his boots on the gravel fading into the night. I worked until 2 in the morning, until my eyes were burning and my hands were shaking from exhaustion. I got the rockshaft housing back on and every line reconnected. The next morning, after just a few hours of sleep, I filled the transmission with fresh Highguard fluid. With my heart in my throat, I climbed onto the seat and turned the key. The engine caught, and for a few seconds the dreaded whine was still there. My stomach clenched, and then it faded. The pump primed. I tentatively moved the hydraulic lever. The 3-point hitch arms rose smoothly, silently. A wave of relief so powerful it almost made me dizzy washed over me. I had done it. I was 3 days behind Earl, but my corn went into perfect soil. As I drove the last pass, I looked over at his fields. The corn was already starting to spike through, but his headlands were a mess of compacted ruts that would choke the roots and steal his yield. My field was clean. It was a small victory, but it was mine. I had faced disaster, and with my own 2 hands and a bit of scrap-pile ingenuity, I had won. I owed no one. The mid-1970s rolled in like a golden tide. It seemed like you couldn't fail if you tried. The Russians were buying American grain by the boatload, and prices shot into the stratosphere. Corn that we used to be happy to get $1.50 a bushel for was suddenly fetching $3, then $3.50. Soybeans were even crazier. Farmers who had been struggling for years were suddenly flush with cash, or at least flush with credit. The mantra from the government, from the banks, from the farm magazines was singular and deafening. Get big or get out. Earl Thompson became the poster boy for that philosophy in our part of the county. The profits from his 73 and 74 crops were staggering, but instead of banking it, he used it as leverage. He bought the 160 acres that came up for sale south of his place, paying a price per acre that made the old-timers at the coffee shop choke on their coffee. To work the new ground, his 1066 wasn't enough anymore. He traded it in for a brand-new International 1466, and then he did something nobody around us had ever seen before. He bought a Steiger, one of those giant four-wheel drive articulated tractors that looked more like a military vehicle than a piece of farm equipment. It was a monster, capable of pulling a 12-bottom plough. The changes weren't just in his fields. He tore down his modest old farmhouse and built a new brick ranch-style house with a two-car garage. His wife, Mary, was suddenly driving a brand-new Chrysler New Yorker. They were the talk of the county, the embodiment of the new agricultural prosperity. Earl walked with a new kind of confidence, the confidence of a man who believes he has the world by the tail. He'd stop me on the road, leaning out of the clean, quiet cab of his new tractor, and shake his head. "Jed, I don't know how you do it with that old junk," he'd say, not with malice anymore, but with a kind of detached pity. "You're working yourself to death for pennies, while the rest of us are finally making a real living." My life, by contrast, seemed to stand still. The high prices were good to me too. For the first time, Sarah and I had a real cushion in the bank. The temptation to follow Earl's path was immense. Mr. Henderson at the bank called me in for a meeting. He laid out a plan on his big mahogany desk. With my farm as collateral, I could borrow enough to double my acreage, buy a new combine, a whole new line of equipment. "Jed, you're sitting on a gold mine," he said, his pen tapping on the loan application. "It's time to cash in." But every time I considered it, I'd hear my father's voice. I'd remember the feel of the grease on my hands in the dead of night, the profound satisfaction of bringing the 40/20 back to life myself. That machine wasn't just iron and steel to me, it was a symbol of my independence. So I took a different path. I didn't buy more land, I didn't build a new house. Instead, I invested in my farm, but I did it my way. I paid cash to have the machine shed rewired and insulated. I bought a heavy-duty air compressor and a used but solid Lincoln arc welder. I found a well-maintained John Deere 4430, a few years newer than my 4020, with a sound guard body that would at least keep the dust and noise down. I paid cash for it from a retiring farmer. I didn't trade the 4020 in, I kept it. Now I had two solid, reliable tractors, both paid for. The talk at the co-op was brutal. They saw me as a man with no ambition, a fool who was letting the opportunity of a lifetime slip through his fingers. "Old Jed Stone, he's so scared of debt he's gonna die poor," I overheard one day. His dad filled his head with all that Depression-era nonsense. Doesn't he know things are different now? Even Sarah, who always stood by me, had her moments of doubt. "Mary Thompson has a new dishwasher and a self-cleaning oven," she said one night, not as a complaint, but as a simple statement of fact, as she stood over our old sink, her hands in the dishwater. I saw the weariness in her eyes, and it stung me more than any of Earl's taunts. "We're saving, Sarah," I told her, putting my arms around her. "We're building a foundation, a strong one." "I know," she sighed, leaning her head back against my chest. "I just wish our foundation had a new dishwasher." The boom years peaked around 78 and 79. Land prices were astronomical, interest rates were starting to creep up, but nobody seemed to notice. They were too busy signing papers for new loans. Earl bought another 80 acres and a brand new 6-row corn head for his combine that cost more than my first tractor. He was farming nearly 1,000 acres now, all of it leveraged to the hilt. He was a king on a throne of debt, but everyone, including him, only saw the throne. One evening in the late fall of 1979, I was listening to the radio in the barn, doing some maintenance on the combine. The grain market's report came on, and the tone was different. The announcer spoke of a grain embargo, of skyrocketing inflation, of a man named Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve who was talking about drastic measures to cool down the economy. After the markets, the local bank's advertisement came on. It was Mr. Henderson's smooth voice, but he wasn't talking about low-interest expansion loans anymore. He was talking about savings bonds and certificates of deposit. A cold wind blew through the open barn door, rattling the tin siding. I shut off the radio and stood there in the sudden silence, the smell of grease and cold steel filling the air. I looked at my machines, my paid-for 4020 and 4430, sitting there like loyal old dogs. I thought of Earl's massive fleet of shiny red iron, each piece tethered to the bank by a long invisible chain, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a fool. I felt a deep, chilling premonition, a sense that the golden tide that had lifted all of our boats was about to recede, and we were all going to find out just how many of us had been swimming naked. The party was almost over, the bill was about to come due. The first sign of the turning tide wasn't a thunderclap. It was a whisper on the wind, a change in the air that only the old-timers seemed to notice. It began in the winter of 1980. The news crackled over the kitchen radio about the grain embargo against the Soviet Union, a political move in a faraway capital that felt like a personal attack on every farmer in Cedar County. The bottom simply fell out of the market. The price of corn, which had been the foundation of so much heady optimism, collapsed. For me, it was a body blow. The numbers in my ledger book, so promising just months before, were suddenly cut in half. But my expenses were fixed and they were low. My biggest costs were fuel, seed, and fertilizer. There were no loan payments due on the first of the month. Sarah and I tightened our belts. We didn't take a vacation that year. The new dishwasher she wanted was put on hold indefinitely. We ate more from our garden and butchered our own hogs. It was lean, but it was manageable. We were afloat. For Earl Thompson, it was the beginning of a nightmare. His entire operation was built on the assumption of $3 corn. His variable rate loans from the bank, which had seemed like practically free money at 7%, were suddenly renewing at 12, then 15, then an unthinkable 18%. The interest payments alone on his land and machinery were more than my farm's total gross income. The first visible crack in his empire appeared that spring. His massive Steiger tractor, the green beast that had been his pride and joy, sat idle in his yard for a week during prime tillage season. The rumor at the co-op was that a planetary hub in one of the final drives had failed. It wasn't a simple fix like a sheared key on my 4020. This was a complex 1,000-pound assembly of precision gears that required specialized tools and a dealer mechanic who charged by the hour from the moment he left the shop. The part itself had to be shipped from Fargo and cost over $5,000. I saw Earl out in the field trying to make do. He was pulling his enormous 32-foot field cultivator with his 1466, a tractor that was woefully undersized for the job. The big red International screamed in protest, black smoke pouring from its stack, the tires clawing desperately for traction. He was burning up his tractor, and he knew it. I saw him one afternoon, standing on the headland, just staring at the struggling machine, his shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen before. The swagger was gone, replaced by the gaunt, haunted look of a man watching his world crumble around him. He got the Steiger fixed, but the cost was staggering. Not long after, Mary's shiny Chrysler New Yorker disappeared, replaced by a used Ford Fairmont. Earl started selling off some of his extra equipment, a grain truck, a hay baler he rarely used, just to generate cash flow. He was selling his iron to feed the bank's insatiable appetite for interest. The pressure made him careless. In his rush to get his soybeans planted, he didn't take the time to properly set his new air planter. I could see it from my fence row. The seed depth was uneven, and the closing wheels were packing the soil too hard over the row. A hard crust formed after the first spring rain, and his bean emergence was spotty at best. It was a mistake a first-year farmer might make, a mistake born of stress and distraction. One sweltering afternoon in July, I was cultivating my corn with the old Farmall M, a slow, methodical job that gave a man time to think. I saw Earl's 1466 stop in the middle of his field. It just sat there for a long time under the blazing sun. Finally, I saw him get out and walk back to his farmstead, a long, slow walk of defeat. Later, I heard the story. The injection pump had gone out. On those older mechanical systems, it was a manageable repair. But his 1466 had a newer, more complex rotary pump. The dealer told him it would be a 2-week wait for a rebuilt unit and a bill that would run close to $3,000. His cornfields, already struggling from a dry spell, were being overrun with water hemp and buttonweed. Without a cultivator tractor, he was helpless to stop them. That evening, after my own chores were done, I did something I hadn't done in years. I drove my 4020, the cultivator still attached, over to Earl's place. I didn't go to the house. I just pulled into his field, dropped the shovels, and started cultivating his corn. The rows were wider than mine, but I made it work. I ran until well after midnight, the tractor's lights cutting a lonely path through the darkness. The next morning, I came back and finished the field. I never said a word to him about it, and he never said a word to me. But a few days later, I found a 5-gallon can of my favorite Rotella engine oil sitting by my fuel barrels. It was his way of saying thank you. It was also, I think, his way of admitting that sometimes the old, simple, reliable way had its merits. The ground between us had shifted. He was no longer the king on the hill looking down on the fool. We were just two farmers, side by side, fighting a war against the weather, the weeds, and the markets, each in our own way. And one of us was losing badly. By 1983, the farm crisis was no longer a whisper. It was a raging inferno. The evening news was filled with images of grim-faced farmers protesting on the steps of state capitals. The local newspaper, once filled with ads for new equipment, was now thick with notices of foreclosure auctions. Every week, it seemed, another neighbor went under. Good, hard-working families who had farmed the same ground for generations were being wiped out. The sense of community, once built on barn raisings and shared harvests, curdled into one of fear, envy, and quiet despair. You didn't dare ask a neighbor how he was doing because you were afraid of the answer. The final blow for Earl Thompson came not from the bank, but from the land itself. The land values, which had been inflated to absurd heights and served as the collateral for all his debt, plummeted. Ground that had been appraised at $3,000 an acre was now struggling to fetch $800. On paper, Earl was instantly catastrophically bankrupt. His debt was more than double the value of his assets. Mr. Henderson, the same friendly banker who had once urged me to cash in on my gold mine, was now a different man. His face was a mask of grim necessity. The bank, under pressure from federal regulators, had no choice but to call in the loans. The auction at Earl Thompson's farm was on a cold, grey Saturday in November. The sky was the colour of lead, and a bitter wind whipped across the harvested fields, carrying the first hint of snow. It was the exact opposite of that sunny, optimistic auction day a decade earlier where Earl had bought his first big tractor. The crowd was small and sombre. No one was there looking for a bargain with a sense of excitement. They were there like vultures or mourners at a funeral. I stood at the back just as I had all those years ago. Earl was there, standing beside his wife, Mary. He looked like a stranger. He'd lost so much weight his clothes hung on him, and his face was a roadmap of sleepless nights and broken dreams. Mary's eyes were red-rimmed, but she stood straight, her hand on his arm, a portrait of quiet dignity in the face of utter ruin. The auctioneer started with the small items from the shop. Tools that Earl had spent a lifetime accumulating were sold off for a pittance. His welder, his air compressor, his socket sets, all gone in a matter of minutes. Then came the big iron. The magnificent Steiger, the symbol of his ambition, was driven up. Its engine sounded as powerful as ever, but it was a hollow sound now. The bidding was sluggish, pathetic. A speculator from out of state bought it for less than a quarter of what Earl still owed on it. Next came the 1466, then his combine, his planters, his discs. Each sale was another nail in the coffin of his life's work. I watched him as the auctioneer's hammer fell again and again. He didn't flinch. He just stared straight ahead, his jaw set, as if he were trying to memorize every last detail of his own destruction. I survived. While my neighbors were drowning in a sea of red ink, I was on solid ground. My income was down, but my farm was my own. My old John Deeres, the 4020 and the 4430, didn't know that interest rates were at 20%. They just needed fuel, oil, and the touch of my own two hands to keep them going. I spent that winter in my warm, well-lit shop, overhauling the engine on the 4020 myself, piece by painstaking piece. It cost me time and sweat, but very little cash. Sarah and I lived simply, but we lived without fear. One evening, she came out to the shop while I was putting the final touches on the tractor. She ran her hand over the new green paint on the engine block. "You know," she said quietly, "Mary Thompson told me at church that the bank is taking their house too. They have to be out by the 1st of the month." I stopped my work and looked at her. In her eyes, I saw not triumph, but a deep shared sorrow. "We don't have a self-cleaning oven, Jed," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "but we have a home. We have this. You did it. Your father would be so proud." I pulled her close, the smell of grease and paint and cold iron clinging to my clothes. The victory I felt wasn't sweet. It didn't taste of success, but of survival. And in the heart of the American farm crisis, survival was everything. A week after the auction, there was a knock on our door. It was late, and a light snow was falling, dusting the bare trees and silent fields in a blanket of white. I opened the door to find Earl Thompson standing on the porch, his collar pulled up against the cold. He wasn't looking at me, but at his own worn boots. "Jed," he said, his voice raspy, "can I talk to you for a minute?" I led him into the kitchen. Sarah poured him a cup of hot coffee, then quietly left us alone. He sat at the table where my family had eaten for 3 generations, turning the warm mug in his hands, which trembled slightly. For a long time, he said nothing. The only sounds were the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the sigh of the wind outside. "They sold it all, Jed," he finally whispered, his eyes fixed on the coffee. "Everything. The house, the barns, the land my granddaddy broke with a team of horses, all gone." He took a ragged breath. "The banker told me I was a great farmer, but a terrible businessman." He said it like he was giving me a compliment. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped his lips. "I'm sorry, Earl," I said, and I meant it. I truly am. He looked up at me then, his eyes full of a pain so profound it was hard to look at. "You were right," he said, the words costing him a visible effort. "All those years I thought you were a fool, an old-fashioned relic. I laughed at you, laughed at your old tractors and your fear of the bank." He shook his head slowly. "But you weren't scared, were you? You were smart. You saw the yoke. I just saw the shiny new plow it was attached to. I put that yoke around my own neck, and I pulled until it broke me." He finished his coffee in silence. As he stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Mary and I are moving in with her sister in town. I'll be looking for work. If you hear of anything at all." His voice trailed off. He was a man who had once been a king in his own fields, now begging for scraps. The following spring, the bank held the auction for the land itself. Earl's parcels were sold off one by one. When the auctioneer came to the original 160 acres, the home place, the heart of his family's farm, I stepped forward. The bidding was slow, nobody had any money. Using the cash I had carefully saved during the good years, the money I hadn't spent on new iron or a fancy house, I bought Earl Thompson's home farm. A murmur went through the crowd. They thought I was just another vulture, picking the bones clean. They were wrong. The next day I found Earl. He was loading boxes into a U-Haul truck in front of his sister-in-law's house in town. I pulled up beside him. "I bought your home place, Earl," I said, getting straight to the point. A flash of anger and betrayal crossed his face. "You too, Jed? I thought you were different." "I am," I said. "I'm not going to farm it." "You are?" He stared at me, uncomprehending. "I'll rent it to you," I explained, "for a third of the crop. You use my equipment this first year until you can get back on your feet. We'll write up a contract, and in 5 years, if you want to, you can buy it back from me for exactly what I paid for it. Not a penny more." He looked at me, his eyes welling up. The tough, proud farmer who had faced his own ruin without shedding a tear finally broke. He sat down on the truck's bumper and buried his face in his hands. I just stood there, giving him the dignity of a moment to himself. It wasn't charity, it was neighborliness. It was the only kind of vindication that mattered. The years that followed were healing years. The farm economy slowly recovered. Earl, with the fire of redemption burning in him, farmed that 160 acres with a passion I'd never seen before. He was a changed man, humbled but not broken. He became one of my closest friends. We worked together, shared machinery, and spent long hours leaning against a pickup truck, talking about crops and weather and life. The community's perception changed too. The men who had once called me a fool now came to me for advice. They saw that my wealth wasn't measured in acreage or shiny paint, but in the freedom to sleep at night. By the early 1990s, life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Sarah finally got her new kitchen, complete with a dishwasher and a self-cleaning oven. The day it was installed, she just stood there watching it run, a quiet, happy smile on her face. It felt better than any new tractor. One crisp autumn afternoon, my grandson Ben, who was about 10 years old, was with me in the shop. He had the same spark in his eyes that I'd had as a boy. I was doing a tune-up on the old 4020, the same tractor that had been the heart of this farm for over 2 decades. Its paint was faded and its seat was cracked, but its engine purred like a contented cat. "Grandpa," Ben asked, handing me a wrench, "why do we still use this old tractor?" "Mr. Thompson's son has a new one with a computer in it." I stopped my work and wiped my greasy hands on a rag. I looked at the boy, then at the tractor. "Ben," I said, "this tractor taught me the most important lesson I ever learned. It taught me the difference between what something costs and what it's worth." I pointed to the engine. "When this breaks, you and I can fix it right here with these tools. We own it. It doesn't own us. That banker in town doesn't get a say in whether it runs or not. It's free, and so are we." I put my hand on his shoulder. "Your great-grandpa told me that debt is a yoke." He was right. But freedom is a piece of land that's paid for, a machine you can fix with your own 2 hands, and the peace of mind to look out at your fields at the end of the day and know that they're truly yours. He looked at the old green tractor with a new understanding, a new respect. I turned the key and the engine fired to life with its familiar, comforting roar. It was more than the sound of an engine. It was the sound of a legacy, of hard-won wisdom, of a promise kept across generations. It was the sound of home.